Okay.
Okay, so we are live. It's Tuesday, the 11th of February, and we are live with Leif Knutsen and me, Henrik Beckheim, here in Norway, and our special guest, Itamar Marcus from Palestinian Media Watch, live in Israel. How are you, Itamar?
Thank you. Thank you, Henrik. Great to be with you
Where are you located now in Israel?
in Jerusalem.
Jerusalem, yeah. How are things? I know there's lots for us to talk about today, but how are things in general? Do you feel in Israel right now?
Uh, the Israeli population is going through turmoil. Um, Everybody wants the hostages out. Everybody's concerned about the extortion from Hamas, which has forced us to release dozens of people who've murdered, some of them sitting 35 life sentences for so many murders they were responsible for. So everybody's concerned, and that's why the emotions are so confused. Historically, 82% of terrorists that Israel has released in these exchange extortion deals have gone back to terror. Uh, among the terrorists that we released in November 2023, just a few months after they were taken hostage by Hamas, of them, uh, Israel's had to arrest already over dozens, and they've already killed four, all of whom were involved in terror. So, what we know we're doing is we're opening up a Pandora's box here for future terror. On the other hand, the country feels we have to save the people who are alive now and dying daily, and that's why the country is going through one of the most emotionally straining periods that I can remember.
Yeah, I understand. It's like it's such a terribly difficult conundrum ethically. Also, I think just looking from outside, it's like you of course you want to save the lives of the hostages, while at the same time you also want to think about future lives being at risk because of Hamas being released. Lots of terrorists who promised to do 7th of October again. Is this a difficult conundrum that most people think about and talk about in Israeli daily life? That this is a common theme that people talk about.
Yes, it's a common theme. The majority of the population, I think, uh, the majority of the population is supporting the exchange. I don't think they're aware of what the previous exchange have cost. For example, Yahya Sinwar, the arch terrorist who planned October 7th, who led Hamas, he was released in a previous prisoner exchange. And all of his cronies who were with him, and all the organizers and all the planners. And we've lost already 2,000 lives because of that. So people have to understand that when we're releasing now arch terrorists who've murdered so many of them, by the way, were planners, organizers, commanders, people who you get into, put them into a group of terrorists, and right away they experience that organizing terror. So it's a major. Now I'll tell you why Israel is going along with it. Uh, the families of the hostages have been on TV, I would say, every day since a month or two after they were taken hostage, and there have been demonstrations in the streets. The families have been putting pressure on the government, and tragically, the I don't blame the families, by the way, but tragically, the main one of the slogans of all these demonstrations has been in Hebrew "B'chol Machir," which means at any cost, at any
Yeah.
cost. And the press, which likes to criticize the right wing government, felt this is great. Let's blame the government for what's going on. Now, I don't blame the families, but who do I blame for this? I blame the PR people who were misguiding the families. And why do I say misguiding the families? Because every time those families went out in the street, it made Hamas stronger. Every time Hamas saw that there were demonstrations against the government to release at all costs, Hamas became more intransigent. So that what happened was the people went to the streets on behalf of their families. And in the end, they made it much harder to get them out, and they raised the costs. Now, like I say, I don't blame them, but there were PR people behind them who were very radical left, very anti government. And I don't believe they were so naive. I think they were using the hostages as a way to make the government look bad. They were using the families as a way to make the government look bad, and that's an outrage. That's an outrage because it has cost so many lives of hostages and of the soldiers who've been fighting to free the hostages.
Yes. And
Let me just tell you, let me just add
yeah.
one thing to this. I know they had to demonstrate. They felt they had to, but they should have been demonstrating against the European Union, demonstrating against the United States, all of them demanding that they cut off relations with Qatar. Qatar is the one who has been fueling Hamas all these years. All the political leaders of Hamas are literally in hotels in Qatar. If all of these countries would have told Qatar, we are breaking off relations with you until you demand that Hamas release the hostages, that would have been completely different because Qatar would have then put all of its pressure on Hamas to release them. They do not want to be isolated internationally. So the families should have been demonstrating against Qatar via the United States, via the European Union, via Norway. And that's why I say they were misguided, because I think this whole thing could have been over a year ago. And if not a year ago, 9 months ago, 10 months ago, had there been tremendous pressure from the families on the Western countries to isolate Qatar.
Yes, and
Why didn't
also,
that
yeah.
happen? Why was the focus so much on what the Israeli government was supposed to do? So much of the anger was directed at the government as if they had the ability to make things happen more quickly.
Right. And the answer is, like I said, there was a very, very well-funded PR campaign. The families weren't funding this. There was millions and millions and millions of dollars into this campaign. There were buses bringing people every week. There were gigantic posters, thousands and thousands of Israeli flags. This was incredibly well orchestrated. There was a PR campaign. The people who were running the PR campaign were similar to people who were running the anti-government demonstrations before the war started. So they basically decided to continue their anti-government, but instead of being anti-government because of judicial reform, they were anti-government because the government supposedly wasn't doing enough for the hostages. Of course, they were the ones who were undermining the government and undermining the hostages through manipulation, really.
What do you feel about the President of the United States, Mr. Trump's comments now, just the other day, or was it this morning? I can't remember, when he was saying that it's Saturday at 12, all the hostages are released, or else all hell will break loose. What do you feel about that?
Any pressure that can be put on Hamas is good, but if you have a threat that you can't fulfill, then it's not good. And I feel that as long as there are hostages there, all hell will never break loose. Israel has been fighting with one hand tied behind her back because we couldn't go into this area, we couldn't go into that area, we couldn't bomb this area. We couldn't do so many things for fear of first of all, for fear of hurting the hostages with the bombings, and second, for fear that the Hamas would just murder the hostages. Both of these things actually happened. We know that hostages were inadvertently killed because terrorists were hiding with the hostages, and we ended up killing, unfortunately, some of our hostages. And we also know that at least 6 hostages were killed just before Israel got to rescue them, because the terrorists realized we were close by. They lined them up against the wall, and they shot each one of them in the back of the head. I mean, this is Hamas. So all hell can't break loose unless we were to decide that we're giving up on the lives of our hostages. Then all hell could break loose. So, and I don't think anyone in Israel is willing to do that. I don't think Trump is willing to do that. So it's unfortunately a nice threat, but I don't believe it's something that he can follow through on. The only thing that he could do is theoretically announce the cutoff of all humanitarian aid. It would take forever to have an effect, because Israel has been under the ceasefire agreement. We've been sending in thousands of truckloads of so-called humanitarian aid. So Hamas could last for a couple of months, probably unjust what we sent in there in the last 3 weeks. So, like I said, it's great to have American support for the release of the hostages, but you can't make a threat that you can't fulfill.
Well, one of the things that I've noticed is that there's talk of putting pressure on Egypt and Jordan, and I suppose also Qatar and Turkey, who have some sway with Hamas. Do you think that'll have an effect if we're able to do something indirectly like that?
Today, I think Qatar has. I don't think the other countries have any real sway. Qatar still holds the purse strings, so they do have sway, but I think they have a lot less sway than they would have had in the early months. But I guess that's true. I mean, if all hell breaks loose against Qatar, that could actually have a very significant effect because Qatar can try to pull the strings of Hamas again.
Mm-hmm.
What about
Well, I
pressure
mean,
on
as
Iran?
we're sitting, yeah.
Please,
Yeah, I was thinking, what about if Trump would apply a lot of pressure on Iran? Do you feel like Iran is the main squid, the octopus behind all of this? So could maximum pressure on Iran perhaps have an effect on this?
it can't hurt. It can't hurt. But I don't think. I mean, Iran has already gone through hell from Israel. They've really gone through hell from Israel. We've destroyed 90% of their air defenses. We could, if we decided tomorrow, we could destroy their nuclear program, which is spread out all over the country. So I'm not. So it could be they could put pressure on Iran as well, but I'm not sure how much pressure Iran at this point. Such a weakened Iran. I'm not sure how much pressure they could actually put on Hamas. They have very little to lose now.
So what do you think
Qatar,
as we're sitting?
I'm saying Qatar has a lot to lose.
I'm sorry, finish
That's
your
why.
sentence.
Yeah, Qatar has a lot to lose. Hamas doesn't have. Iran doesn't have that much to lose, so there's not that much pressure. Qatar has an international standing that they don't want to lose. So that is, like you suggested, that is a source that the United States could still put a tremendous amount of pressure on.
So what do you think? What options do you think the Security Cabinet is discussing now as we speak? The Israeli Security Cabinet.
The cabinet has a number of things to discuss. The most urgent is the release that's supposed to happen on this coming Saturday. Hamas has already frozen it, saying that Israel's not fulfilling its part of the deal. Of course, we are, so no one knows exactly what they're planning. If they don't release our people on Saturday, it sounds like Israel is going back to war. All leaves have been canceled in the south, and the army has been told to prepare to retake the corridors that Israel has recently given over to the Palestinians and international forces. So that's what Israel's talking about right now. What do we do if they don't release our people on Saturday? And it's a fateful decision, because if they don't release our people on Saturday and we continue negotiating, there's a chance we'll get them. If we don't continue negotiating, and if we say, okay, that's it, they broke it, we're going back to war, that really is almost a death sentence for everyone. So there are only bad choices for Israel right now.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think motivates? I mean, clearly these allegations of Israel violating the truce are just a pretext, right? There's got to be some underlying reason for why Hamas would do this, because even though it's a no-win situation for Israel, it's a no-win situation for Hamas as well. They're putting themselves out on a limb here by going back on the whole process that goes into this extortion deal.
What Hamas wants is to have Israelis go out in the streets and blame the government again. I saw it on the news last night, and again, it was shocking and it was painful to see family members who know that their sons specifically are in chains, literally have been in chains since soon after October 7th, a year in chains, not moving. It's just unimaginable. And they were on TV and they were crying and they were screaming, Netanyahu, you must release my son. If it was your son, cabinet. So this kind of emotional pressure that the families are putting, this is exactly what Hamas is trying to get out of it. And by putting the blame on Israel, even though it's not Israel's fault, they're giving ammunition to the people who are running this emotional campaign against the government, these left-wing forces, to get the families to go out and blame Netanyahu.
But what would Hamas have to gain with that? From that, would they get more of their own terrorist prisoners released, or would they have an easier time regaining power in Gaza or in the West Bank, Judea, and Samaria? Like, what is it? They have a strong interest now in coming back and sort of restoring things to October 6th, right? And it's unclear to me how this contributes to that.
What it contributes to is Israel has not yet started talking about the next stage of negotiations now. In the next stage of negotiations, assuming we get past this impasse now, we get 3 and then another 3, another 3 for another couple of weeks. There's supposed to be a second stage, which is supposed to finalize. The Palestinians are talking about 3,000 terrorists. They're talking about all of the terrorists who are serving life sentences. That's what Hamas is talking about. And I think by Hamas, what they're trying to do is create a lot of emotional pressure by the families on the government to say, you have, and because that's what they were saying last night. A lot of these families last night who were screaming at the government were families whose children or loved ones were in the next deal. They aren't even scheduled yet to be released. So what they were able to do, Hamas, instead of having things moving slowly, Hamas has now created a crisis. And with the crisis, people go to the streets and they start blaming the government and demanding the government. And like I said, it's misguided and misdirected, but that's what's happening.
But, I'm hearing a lot of Israelis also comment on the fact that Netanyahu in particular has done so little he hasn't visited the kibbutzim. He hasn't visited with the families of the hostages. He seems to be so remote from the kind of agony that people have experienced, and he's postponed yet again this commission of inquiry about what went wrong on October 7th. It seems like he's not helping his own case very much either by his conduct with these people who are so affected by this.
Yes, I think the reason he didn't visit the families was because many of the ministers who did visit the families, they were used by the families as an opportunity not to have discussion, but to yell and scream and condemn and blame. And it served no purpose. And like I said, it hinders the possibility of getting their loved ones released, because Hamas gets strengthened by this. So that to go into essentially into the lion's den, where all these people are primed to attack you like they do every night on television, it would absolutely be a disaster, and Hamas will be sitting there checking up all their points. Oh, we got more today, more pressure, and more degradation of the government. So I think that's why he didn't. I'm not sure it was the right decision. I think he possibly should have gone and met with them and maybe had some conditions up front about the discussion, maybe no cameras. I think it should have happened, and like you said, he owes that to them. But he made that decision, and again, the press, which is anti-Netanyahu for the most part, has twisted that into, oh, you see, he doesn't even care about them, which of course is completely false.
And Itamar, what do you think about the game shows, the scenes that Hamas creates when they are supposed to release the hostages? What do you think about these whole absurd scenes that they're creating?
They, of course, their outrageous abuse of our hostages. Give them their dignity, let them go. I think to a certain extent it's backfired on Hamas. Every one of them, the young soldiers who are young girls in their 19s and 20s, who were released and surprised Hamas by getting up there, looking healthy, smiling, waving to the cameras, essentially a statement of defiance. You've tortured us for 15 months, and we're defying you by coming out as solid, strong human beings in spite of all the horrors that you inflicted on us. So that was a failure for them. And the next one was also equally a failure when the prisoners, the hostages, came out literally looking like Holocaust survivors. Now, you think about the Holocaust, the ones who were rescued by the Allies were the ones who were probably in jail about 15 months, because people who were in Holocaust in concentration camps more than 15, 20 months or 2 years, most of them didn't survive. So this is what a year of Holocaust-like environment looks. It looks just like those people look. I would say that in the Holocaust, they were outside, they got sun, they got some vitamin D, they got some exercise, they could move. In many respects, 1 year, the way they were, no light, a quarter of a pita a day sometimes, no normal water. They had conditions for the last 15 months, if you could compare it to 15 months in many of the concentration camps, their conditions were just as bad or worse.
We have some questions here as well. One from Eliza, who says, is Israel really breaching this deal, or is it Hamas that makes this up?
Yes, Hamas is making this up. Thousands of trucks have gone through. Even this morning, after Hamas announced the freezing of the release, Israel this morning sent in, I think, another 600 trucks. So trucks of supplies. So it's a complete lie, but never stopped Hamas.
Yeah, I read even the UN had to confirm that Israel had ramped up the supply of humanitarian supplies significantly. And I noticed that the other thing Hamas said was that Israel was complaining about that Israel had been firing at people who had violated the perimeter, I guess in the Netzarim corridor, and shot and killed 3 people who, by Israeli accounts, actually were armed. And were not just civilians who made a mistake about where they were supposed to be. So
Israel,
as I said earlier, this seems like just a pretext for Hamas to do this.
yes, one of the biggest complaints that the Israeli population has against the government and against the army is that there were violations of our border. There were terrorists coming up to the border and civilians coming up to the border, which is just a few hundred, which is literally just across the fence from the Israelis' fields. These are agricultural settlements, kibbutzim. They had, and just across the fence, they had their fields, and the terrorists were coming up to these fences, and the Israeli army would shoot warning shots in the air. They never took it seriously. People complained for years, literally. And the army had this very accepting attitude. Okay, it doesn't really matter. We're very strong. They're going to touch us. And so what's happened now is the perimeter that's being violated is not the corridor in the center of Gaza. It's the perimeter. Israel has 700 meters that they marked off. And they said anyone who comes within the 700 meters or even approaches them, Israeli army is still within 700 meters, but anyone who even approaches, I think, another 300 meters is walking into a death zone. And then what's happened was they weren't shooting at them, and Israelis were furious. On all the television stations, left, right, everybody was complaining. This is the same mistake you make before. You let 1 in, you let 2 in, you're going to let 100 in. Anyone who's there has to be shot, has to be killed. That we can't allow monsters from Gaza. And we know that the entire population of Gaza, according to polls, supports Hamas, supports what they did, supported October 7th. We're proud of October 7th. So you can't let anybody near the border, anyone who comes, and even if it's a civilian, it's probably a terrorist just testing, you have to shoot them.
We have another question here as well. What's your take, Itamar, on Francesca Albanese's recent visit to Oslo and her getting praise from Norwegian ministers of parliament?
if ever there was uh, an anti-Semite, a Jew hater, hater of Israel in a position of significance internationally, it's Francesca Albanese. Uh, her statements, her vicious hatred, her total support for not just the Palestinian side but the extremism, and her refusal to condemn the terrible atrocities in any real way. This is not a person that should be welcome in any country. The fact that the UN appointed that, we know what the UN is an anti-Israel body, period. Uh, but the fact that a Western country, Norway, should invite her, even give her a visa to land in the country, oh my God, to respect her and to praise her, it's just it's I think any MP who prays to is degrading himself or herself.
How do you think? How can that happen? How can we have gotten to a place where that is happening, where a person such as her is getting praise from members of parliament?
Look, the world has been so strange in the last year. Um, Israel, I think it's the first time in history that a democratic country was attacked with a massive terror attack by terrorists, and the international community is split on whether they should be going after the terrorists. After 9/11, no one thought that the United States should do everything possible to get bin Laden, everything possible to destroy Al Qaeda. Uh, the United States is still today, even the Biden administration, we're still attacking Al Qaeda around the world. 9/11 was 20 years ago, and they're still doing it. But Israel, oh no, worry about this, worry about that. Are you giving your enemy enough water? Are you giving your enemy enough fuel? Are you giving them enough food? The atrocities of October 7th, the murders, the rape, the burning people alive, were comparable by all accounts to a single day in the Holocaust in many different places. Were comparable to the Holocaust, and nobody was telling the Allies when they fought against Germany to make sure that the German people have enough water, make sure that the German people have enough humanitarian aid. You have to be careful when you bomb not to hurt civilians. That was unheard of. If anyone thinks Hamas is different than Nazi Germany, it's of course. It's not just the one day. Hamas's goal is the extermination of Jews. And they say this openly. And even worse than the Nazis, they feel this is their destiny from Allah. They feel this is their Islamic destiny. This is what God himself wants of Muslims, is the extermination of Jews. The only way humanity will have its redemption and be saved is if the Muslims exterminate the Jews. So this is what we're dealing with. This is what we're facing. And we're trying to destroy them. And the world's complaining to us, and the world is condemning us, and the Security Council, everybody. Oh, you're not working. You're causing starvation. My God, if they would have starved the Nazis and the Germans, would anybody have complained? No.
Since you follow the Palestinian media, what this is something we get very little insight in. How is the mood there, and how's it shifted over the last few months or the last year and a half? Since October 7th.
Okay, so the first thing that has to be said about October 7th is that the Palestinian Authority, those people who were welcomed in Oslo and welcomed in all the capitals of Europe and in Washington, the Palestinian Authority has never condemned October 7th. In fact, the opposite is true. The Palestinian Authority has defended October 7th many times. Some of the top leaders, person like Jibril Rajoub, who's Fatah Central Committee Secretary. Many people think he might be the next leader after Abbas. What did he say? He said October 7th was an epic day of heroism. We saw actions of epic and heroism. And this is the person who supposedly is a moderate. And by the way, he gets visas. He travels around the world. And he thinks October 7th, and he said this, by the way, a few months after. Already in December, he knew what happened. Everybody knew what happened, and yet that's how he described it. Fatah, one of their telegram stations, right after October 7th, just put a picture. It was a picture of a boot. The boot had the color of the Palestinian flags, and lying on the ground was an Israeli flag and a dead rat on top of the flag, and the boot, the Palestinian boot, was crushing the dead rat. This is the way Fatah. So the first thing that we have to make sure to understand is this was done primarily by Hamas, but it has the entire support of the Palestinian leadership on the Fatah side, the Palestinian Authority, and talk about the population. Palestinian polling center based in Ramallah took a poll in November. This was the first poll after October 7th, November 2023. So that it was a month after. By now, all the videos had gone viral of all the atrocities, all the rape, everything had been seen by every Palestinian. And they were asked, do the events of October 7th and its aftermath make you feel proud as a Palestinian? What was the answer? 98% said yes. And in fact, 94% said extremely proud. 4% said somewhat proud. Extremely proud. So the entire Palestinian population was exhilarated, proud of this incredible destruction of Jews. And that's why people say, oh, it's just Hamas. It's the Palestinian population. I'll tell you, I've been telling leaders in Norway, in Oslo, and around the world for years that we have to change the Palestinian education. We have to fix the school books. I've been hearing so many Palestinians and so many Palestinian parents lately talking about their children. They're proud of the children doing this. And I think, we don't just have to change the school books. We have to change the parents too.
I just had Dr. Einat Wilf on my podcast here, and she has coined the term Palestinianism. What do you think about this term as a name for an ideology and an identity that also encompasses? I think she said that even everything from people on Western college campuses running around screaming from the river to the sea, all of that is encompassed in the term Palestinianism. What do you think about this?
Yes, I agree. I've been using the term Palestinianism for a number of years, primarily focusing on turning the Arabs of Israel and turning the Arabs of Judea and Samaria and Gaza into Palestinians by creating this Palestinianism. It was this whole movement to make them think there's something that they weren't. And this Palestinianism has been so destructive because, take Israeli Arabs, for example. Once Palestinianism set into their identity, it makes it harder for them to be faithful Israeli citizens, which I think many of them would like to be. I don't know the exact numbers today. It's constantly changing. But if there were no Palestinianism, if there were none of this false creation of you are a Palestinian, then there'd never be an issue. Just remember, when the state of Israel was created, Palestine was not an Arab identity. Even UN resolutions dealing with the region talked about Palestinian Jews and Palestinian Arabs, Palestinian Jews and Palestinian Arabs. It was a British mandate identity. It had nothing to do. And after the state of Israel was created, or specifically really in 1965, when Fatah and PLO and Fatah were created, that's when Palestinianism was created. They defined, okay, we are the new Palestinians. And as the new Palestinians, we're going to take over all the history that happened in this region for the last 5,000 years and claim it's ours. And that's all what Palestinianism is involved in. It's creating this myth of a 5,000-year-old Palestinian people. It's making the myth that Jesus was a Palestinian. All of this is part of the Palestinianism, which just expands into this thing. And therefore, because of this, they have all the rights, and Jews don't have any rights.
Yeah. Leif just texted me now that the security cabinet meeting has just ended after 4.5 hours. What does that say just in itself, just the fact that it took 4.5 hours to have such a meeting?
I think just like I said, the Israeli population is split. And no one knows really. We have a bad decision and we have a worse decision, and what we have to decide is which is the bad and which is the worst. And the same way, it's just like it's hard for you and I and the Israeli population to decide what do we do if they don't, and what about our hostages? So the Israeli they don't have that much more information. I hate to say it, in terms of the hostages. They have to make these terrible decisions, and that's what they're sitting there. They're sitting there trying to put every little piece of information. Maybe try to see what do we know about where the hostages are. Could that, so they're just trying to put everything together, and that's why it took so long, because there is no good answer. There are only bad answers.
I also see headlines that the family of hostage Omri Miran said they got sign of life as of July 2024. So that's 6 months ago.
Yeah.
That is no guarantee that he's alive now, right? I mean, it's just I guess it's something they just received. That's part of this whole. I hate to call it this, but this sort of like very bizarre negotiation between Hamas and Israel that puts Israel in this incredible quandary that we've been discussing this time.
When they talk about signs of life at a stage like this, right after some of the hostages were released, what it usually means is that one of the released hostages either saw this person in July or heard from someone who saw him in July. It's that kind of thing. They sit down, they talk, they say that they want to get every name. Who was killed that you know about, who did you see dead, who did you see alive, and then they pass this information on to the families. There was also an announcement just yesterday of an 80-year-old Israeli who turns out was apparently murdered on October 7th, and they kidnapped his body. So that was again. So we're hearing a sign of life from July, and another we're hearing is confirmed dead since October 7th.
And also, Itamar, what do you think about, aside from this, the Mr. Donald Trump's idea about Gaza, about you creating it as an American zone, or what do you think about his idea around those things?
Look, it's actually a brilliant idea, not just for Israel, because it guarantees the end of Hamas, but for the Palestinian population. We actually reported, Palestinian Media Watch reported, as soon as he announced this, we went back to the polls that were taken amongst Palestinians before October 7th, and what did we find? 44% of the Gazans in 2023, at the end of 23, just before the war started, 44% of age 18 to 28. Excuse me. 44% of age 18 to 28 wanted to leave Gaza, didn't want to stay there. They wanted to emigrate. And 31% of the entire population. So this was living under Hamas, was such a hell that 44% of the youth wanted to go, 31%. So they wanted to leave now. Since then, a tremendous percentage of Gaza Strip has been destroyed. They say 70% of the houses are unlivable. That means it's going to be a zone for the next, first of all, just destroying all the houses, clearing the rubble. I mean, it's going to take so many years. It's just not even imaginable to think about how many years. That means the Gaza Strip is going to be a dust bowl wherever you're living for many, many years. So you're telling me that those 44% hasn't doubled to 88% by now? And then a young person who's 18 or 20 or 25 say, well, to sort of take a break for 10 years now while sit in the tent for 10 years or in a caravan on the side and wait for them to rebuild, and then you'll start your life. And then, no one wants that. No one wants that. So the first thing you have to realize is that his offer, his suggestion that other Arab countries take these people, that is the ultimate humanitarian message. The only people who don't want these people from Gaza to be freed and to have a new life are the people who see them as political pawns to make Israel miserable, to keep Hamas in power, to keep the so-called refugee problem alive. But anyone who cares about them as individuals, as human beings, has to support the idea of letting them go and letting them settle and letting them have freedom and a citizenship in a new country.
Leif, do you have a final question also for Itamar? We're gonna thank him for his time going soon, but do you have some final questions, Leif?
Well, I'm still kind of curious about the mood among the Palestinians. I mean, because on the
Your
one hand,
audio is a bit dull now, Leif. If you can repeat the question. Your audio
sorry,
was yeah, now it's better.
now it's better. Because it seems to me, but this is me very much reading the tea leaves, is that the Palestinians are also tired of the war and of Hamas and Hamas constantly doing things that just causes more trouble for them. And to what extent is this fatigue, affecting their outlook on their futures and the options that they have, both, in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, and Gaza?
Well, let's talk first about Judea and Samaria. All the polls since the war have shown incredible support for Hamas because it was a successful attack on Israelis. In fact, it was very interesting. The last poll done by Khalil Shkaki just before the war found 12% of Palestinians support Hamas. The first poll he did after the war began and after October 7th, found 47% support for Hamas. So Hamas, the Palestinians were thrilled with what happened. As I told you, 98% were proud of what happened. So Hamas is still and the polls today, over 70% still support Hamas and October 7th. So Hamas, that's in the West Bank. In Gaza, the support is much, much less because the people have suffered and that were abused by Hamas. So that's why the Gazans will be thrilled to leave, to be rid of Hamas, and to have a new life somewhere else in Norway, Western Europe. But in the poll that we publicized, by the way, I just point out that the countries that they wanted to go to were first Turkey, then Egypt, then they wanted to go to the United States and Canada. So that was interesting, I thought. Those were the choices of the Gazans who wanted to leave.
Yeah. Like everybody else, they want the opportunity to have a better life.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And that's what Trump's plan should be seen as, and not as a quote unquote transfer, but literally just allowing these people not even a good, just to have a life. There is no life possible in Gaza for many years now.
Yeah. And Itamar, we thank you so much for your time and that you could join us on such a short notice. And people should check out your work that you're doing with the Palestinian Media Watch, where you're actually closely monitoring what's happening in Palestinian media. And well, thank you so much. And perhaps we can call you up another time also when we're doing these live sessions. It's great to have your input and your thoughts about this from your experience.
Thank you very much. Great to be with you, Leif and Henrik.
Thank you. Okay, bye. Thank you.
Likewise. Take care.
Yeah, that
Be
was
safe.
interesting. That was interesting to hear from Itamar Marcus over there. So great that people can just join us. As you're noticing, Norwegian people also were speaking English today. So I hope you bear with us with that, since we have many international guests and international viewers today on YouTube Live and on X and on Facebook. We make it a bit easier for everybody with speaking English. We're also going to have a new guest coming on very soon at 4 p.m. local time here in Norway, at 5 p.m. local time in Israel. We're going to have Samuel Hyde, who's from the Jewish People Policy Institute, and I see him logging in just now, coming to the stage. Hi, Samuel. How are you? You're live on the show here.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Good to see you again. We met last in Oslo here, in the swimming around in the Oslo fjord and in the hot sauna, where we were doing a speaking session with Kos and Kals here.
Yeah, I speak about it quite often back out of people in Israel and tell them what a truly magical experience actually that was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How have you been since we last met?
Yeah, pretty good. I mean, work's been busy. I came back from Berlin, also a work trip in Berlin on like a de-radicalization program just a week ago. But I mean, the current climate in Israel, let's say, is one of intense emotion and concern over the recent developments.
Definitely. Can we just first just explain to our audience a little bit more about who you are? You're a writer also for the Jerusalem Post, right? And
Yeah,
you work
correct.
at the Jewish People Policy Institute. What are they doing there at that institute? What's the main goal of that place?
Yeah, well, it's a private think tank research institute. We do research into various issues related to the Jewish people and the Middle East, both inside the Jewish people, both inside of Israel as well as in the diaspora. So we deal with issues concerning policy towards anti-Semitism, as well as issues relating to religion and state within Israel and democracy. And I mainly work on Middle Eastern affairs and focus predominantly on anti-Semitism within the Muslim world and the Islamist worldview and how that has really shaped and influenced the conflict overall. So that's pretty much a summary of
Yeah.
it.
Yes, and this is also Leif Knutsen, by the way, my friend here, who
Good to
we
meet you.
usually have these live emergency
Likewise.
podcasts when things are happening, and
Yeah, yeah.
let's dive into it as we're speaking. We had just had a session that the security cabinet held, which was lasting for 4.5 hours. It has
Mm.
just ended, given the situation with the hostages that are supposed to be released now, but that has been postponed by Hamas, claiming that Israel has broken the deal. What are your initial thoughts about this situation here?
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe just as an overview, I mean, we all know that the vast majority of Israelis were essentially willing to end the war in exchange for the hostages, and that being fully aware of the costs, right? Not in any sense of naivety, and not just the cost being the release of terrorists with Israeli blood on their hands, but the real possibility that Hamas might survive as Gaza's rulers. The way I'm seeing this, Hamas in essence rescinding on the deal, could be one of two things. It could actually be a confession of their weakness, despite the theatrics of power, or at least this is what it could tell us, despite their kind of theatrics and psychological power shows that they've been trying to do in all these hostage releases. And that would be because they see no viable path to reestablishing their control. And the reason I say this is important is because the hostages for Hamas have never been just mere leverage for a prisoner swap, but they've in essence been an insurance policy to secure their own survival. The hostages to be exchanged for Hamas being able to reconstitute its authority post the war, regardless of the outcome of the war. So that strategy with Trump coming in is failing, and the Arab states not coming to the table in any meaningful way. The truth of the matter is, if that is the case, then who's going to pay the price of this like sadistic game? Of course, it's going to be Israelis, but Gaza will pay a price. I mean, you know, and the truth is whether or not Hamas can afford to pay that price. Now, you know, Hamas and their ideology, they don't care about Gaza or Gazans, but because they don't have that power, they might not be able to actually pay that price. The second thing, and I'm really sorry to say this beyond words, but it must, maybe it is something that needs to be expressed. And, you know, because I am starting to fear, and I think that there is this kind of growing concern on the streets of Israel, that Hamas has essentially frozen the hostage deal because the world was horrified at the condition of the hostages released on Saturday. There was a massive outcry about this, and it was by no means played out like this on purpose. They by no means released the hostages who looked in better condition, let's say, who appeared to be in better condition first, hoping that, you know, over the next weeks, kind of international attention would kind of weigh in from the weekly hostage releases. but that's kind of backfired. And if that's the case, it's actually far scarier than the first thing I introduced, because we do have some sort of intel that the hostages that remain are in worse condition. And if that's the case, and if Hamas has concluded that it's actually too costly to release them, granted they cannot stay in power, well, then one has to be gravely concerned for what the actual future of the hostages will be. So that's my kind of assessment. Two possibilities of what could be playing out right now.
Well, if the second scenario is true, and I'm horrified to think that as well, then what that suggests is they're basically overplaying their card and trying to get as much bargaining leverage from two things. One is by pretending that they have more to bargain with in terms of living hostages than we were hoping. And the second thing is putting more time pressure, because basically what they're saying, the longer you wait, the more probable it is that the remaining hostages will get in considerably worse shape, right? And that this pressure to sort of resolve the hostage issue quickly is going to cause Israel to give more concessions than they originally agreed to do. Which is, of course, a nasty game, but Hamas is capable of playing very nasty games.
Yeah, and I think that's maybe why Trump's response, I have many things to say about Trump that might not be the most flattering, but Trump's response in setting this hard deadline with basically a threat of all hell will break loose if there isn't this exchange, and calling essentially for the release of all the hostages by Saturday at 12, that's precisely why that decision that he made is not just rational, but it's actually necessary in my view, at least the way I see things, because you're right. I mean, this is what Hamas has done with the hostages. They basically utilized the hostages in a really sadistic game, in essence, to divide Israel and Israelis against each other and themselves, basically forcing Israelis into a choice: continue the war at the risk of hostages' lives, and basically reneging on our commitment in the state to the sanctity of human life. And that's been a policy of Israel's since the establishment of the state, and really, if you want to go even deeper into it, kind of core principle of Zionism. But beyond that, the other thing is, sacrifice the hostages to continue the war because of the risk of the future of your future security if they are able to retain their authority. So this is the sadistic game that Hamas has actually been playing for the last 16 months, and now it's really coming to a head. And it does have the possibility to divide Israelis against themselves and against the state and against each other. And us in Israel have to be very aware that this is the game that's being played against us. I think most people are, but it definitely has the potential to divide people in very drastic ways. So we need to be aware that of not playing their game, which is why I think Trump's response was the only rational and perhaps necessary response.
Yes, how is this being received in the Israeli public? Just your perception of it, people that you speak to, people in general in Israel, how are they speaking about this? How are they receiving this?
Yeah, I mean, there's mixed emotions, right? There's on the one hand, you have people saying, well, this was obvious, this was a bad deal, and we need to re-enter the war because we can't allow these sadists, jihadists to remain in power for any longer. You've interestingly, I mean, I know a Palestinian activist, Hamza Khawidi, quite well, who's very, anti-Hamas. He's basically making that point, number one, right? So there's that element to it. But then at the same time, you've got people who are saying, listen, like, you look at the condition of the hostages on Saturday, and if the intel is correct, that says that the condition of the other hostages is worse, you need to just give absolutely everything to get them back. So this is the exact position Hamas wants to have Israelis in, making a choice between sadism and masochism, essentially, and and either risking their future security or to save the hostages, or risk the hostages for eliminating Hamas. That's where Hamas wants us. So we can't allow ourselves to be stuck there. That's how I feel. We can't allow ourselves to be stuck in that game. Exactly how we get out of that, I don't know. But, this is why I keep hitting back on the point about what Trump is doing in this kind of standoff and raising the bar and saying, oh, well, actually, no, what you will do is on Saturday 12, you'll release all of them, not even in stages. All of them will be released, is pretty much the only thing that I think we could do that doesn't play into their hands. But the emotions in Israel are flipping from one side to the other and changing. All you have to do is scroll through your Twitter feed and you'll basically see an entire array of emotions from the same person in a matter of an hour, and that would be the best way to kind of explain it.
So it seems to me from afar, Samuel, that there's two extreme points. One, which is sort of the Ben Gvir Smotrich kind of thing that says, let's just continue with the war because that's the only way to do. We have to destroy Hamas at all costs,
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the other extreme, which is like, no, we need to rescue the hostages at all costs. But most Israelis, is my impression, understand that this is a horrible, horrible, horrible dilemma, including some of the hostage families.
Yeah,
right?
Sure.
Who understand that the more, the more valuable, the more Hamas gets out of the hostages, the more they're going to try to play that hand for whatever it's worth. And the less likely it is, in fact, that the hostages will be released. But on a human emotional level, I can't imagine what it's like.
Yeah, I mean, look, if you speak to most Israelis, those even on the other extreme that we were speaking about, who are just in favor of the deal at all costs, they will still say to you, we know Hamas can't remain in power, so we need to stop the war now and deal with them later. Like, that's the sentiment even of the people on the other extreme. Now, whether that's even a wise policy or something that's possible is completely different. Is a completely different question. But I don't think that there's anyone, even the people who've been willing to end the war at the possibility of Hamas ruling Gaza, who are comfortable with Hamas permanently being in place in Gaza, comfortably going back to the October 6th status quo. The problem on the other side of the extreme with people like Ben Gvir and Smotrich about resuming the war is this government have just proven over and over again that they have absolutely no plan, right? If you look at the great wars that have defeated some of the greatest ideologies, right? Some of the greatest ideologies, like destructive ideologies in the world, they were all defeated not just militarily, but because there was an actual political program that followed up with it. This was true for Nazi Germany. This was true for Japan and the Imperial Japan post-World War. This government have no desire to create that. And in part, we have to acknowledge that, we can blame Biden as much as we want. And to be honest, Biden's strategy has probably been proven time and time again to be totally incorrect. But nonetheless, Israel is a sovereign state with a sovereign government and a people who make decisions on behalf of Israel that are elected. And they've made no decisions. And this is actually the problem that's always been with Netanyahu. People misread Netanyahu. They think he's a far-right extremist. Netanyahu has almost zero ideology. He's a man purely of interest. So he'll go with the far right when he needs to go with the far right, just like he went with Ehud Barak on the left when he needed to go with Ehud Barak. And it doesn't serve Netanyahu's interest to make any drastic decisions, which is why he's always threatened to get rid of Hamas. He's always threatened to stop Iran's nuclear program. He's always threatened to do a whole array of things and never actually does them because he's actually just too careful to do anything. And we're, so on the totally other side, they may have a point about the future security of the state. For sure, I think that's a very valid, concern. But I don't think that's what's motivating Ben Gvir and Smotrich in the first place anyway. They got their own political ambitions with Gaza, which the world wouldn't allow and most Israelis don't want. And I don't even think Netanyahu would want to recontrol Gaza in that way and settle Gaza and return to a pre-2005 reality, right? So So there has to be a political program here that's going forward, and we're not seeing that from the political leaders. And that's also not helping the desperation of Israelis, right? Because Israelis then are basically left with this choice that Hamas is giving them. Risk the hostages, okay, to destroy Hamas, or, okay, destroy Hamas, risk the hostages to destroy Hamas, or leave Hamas in power, okay, to gain the hostages. That's basically the play that's happening here. Now, the Israeli government, it's their duty, it's their responsibility to create alternative strategies that mute Hamas from being able to use that and create alternative political outcomes here, which they've invested absolutely no time in doing in the last 16 months, which is a great catastrophe. So I don't have the answer, but the truth is that Israelis ultimately are still, we want them all back now, right? Like someone commented that. I saw a comment on Facebook pop up. I don't know. Yeah, there it is. I don't know if she's from Israel or where she's from, but ultimately that is the sentiment. And it's the Israeli government's job to create a reality where we get those hostages back now and keep Hamas out of governing power. That was their two stated objectives. If they weren't able to achieve it, or had no idea of how to achieve it, or had no plan to achieve it, they never should have promised that. They never should have repeated it week after week after week for 16 months. So they have to come to the table now, and they have to start creating alternatives. So my criticism extends harshly to the Israeli government, who seem to have forgotten that you can't win a war by having no sort of political program or post-war initiative afterwards. I mean, it's never been the case. The Americans, the British, no one ever won a war without that kind of program. Churchill and Roosevelt were creating, initiatives while London was being bombed by Luftwaffe bombers, right? That's leadership right there. Okay, thank God they won the military war so that they could implement that. But like, you have to have that. And the IDF has been criticizing the government on this for months. So we're stuck due to our own doing, even in some ways. You know, it's a really difficult situation. It's hard to admit because it feels like somewhat of a defeat and an even graver injustice on top of it.
And Samuel, what do you think about why are Hamas staging these whole game show kind of style settings? Why are they doing that? What's the motivation behind that?
Well, that's a show of force, right? That's like a theatrical display, and I think it's got two audiences. We're the one audience, the Israelis, and by extension maybe the Americans and the Western world, and to show that they're still in control of Gaza, even though they're actually not. And the second audience is the Gazans themselves, to basically show what will happen to you if there's any sort of dissent, right? But this really does bring me on to a point here, because just in general about Gaza and Palestinians. I mean, now would be the moment for Palestinians, the ones that were constantly told are opposed to Hamas, to step forward in some way, even if that means it's the Palestinian Authority, right? And even if only for themselves, okay? Because if Hamas doesn't release the hostages, like if that's where this is going to go, if it's going to go to that extreme and they don't cave on Trump's demand and they actually don't release the hostages and all our fears come true, then the war does resume. And that should be reason enough for these Palestinians that I'm referring to act. Because, you know, to refer to World War II as we did, there were Germans at the end of the war that attempted to assassinate Hitler and dismantle the SS. There were people from, you know, the White Officer Guard who attempted to end Stalin's reign. You know, if all hell supposedly breaks loose and no Palestinians step forward, even if it is just the PA, the message that Israelis are going to get is one that we've heard before, most clearly after the Second Intifada, after the Palestinians had rejected a peace proposal, that there's no meaningful dissent against these jihadist factions because there's actually material support. Now, whether or not that's even true is actually totally secondary to the reality that will unfold from Israelis receiving that message and the war in Syria, right? So I keep trying to appeal to people on the other side of this argument that you really can think what you want about Israel. You can think Israel's the most evil country in the world and that Israelis, by extension, are somehow the most evil people. But even if all you care about is Palestinians, you should want this for them. You should want them to be free of this lunatic ideology, okay? And that requires a demand of Palestinian agency. And those who are refusing to demand agency on behalf of the Palestinians now step forward and actually do something. I mean, the people have been requesting the PAs undergo some sort of reform effort since October 8th. They've done nothing of a kind. I'm not even saying the PA is preferential or should be preference. I'm just saying that's the alternative that exists. They've done nothing of a kind, right? So for people, if no one is demanding that agency, I think that those people who are not prepared to demand that agency actually don't care about peace, probably never have, right? Again, you can think what you want about Israel, okay? But you know, it doesn't change the fact that there's no better life waiting for Palestinians in Gaza with Hamas, right? This is just a fact that doesn't change dependent on what your opinion or views of Israel or Israeli policy is, even if they're good faith or if they're anti-Semitic views. The most extreme views on Israel, that fact still doesn't change. There's no better future for the Palestinians with Hamas in power. So, I don't know where we go from here, but better minds are hopefully dealing with this and have more information, I suppose, than I do. But it's a very difficult circumstance that we find ourselves in today.
Picking up on that, Samuel, one of the things that I've thought about is, and I think about a lot, is that it seems to me that a lot of people, including in the Western world, think that it's achievable to restore, Gaza and Israel to October 6th, right?
Yeah.
But even under the scenario where Israel gives Hamas everything they want in order to free the hostages, the border is going to be sealed, right? There is going to be all kinds of things to prevent Hamas from doing anything like that. And I guarantee that's going to affect the civilian population in Gaza.
Of course.
Because even if they support the Palestinian cause and from the river to the sea and all that kind of stuff, the amount of hardship they're going through is not, now and in the future in this kind of scenario is unsustainable. And to your point, that alone should be a reason for people to think beyond, life after Hamas, because almost anything would be better than having them continue this fight, even if it's behind different walls and barriers.
Yeah, well, the point you're bringing up is really important because it really separates the good faith actors here from the bad faith actors immediately. It immediately separates the people because the people who genuinely have a care for the Palestinians would be able to acknowledge that. They even the ones who despise Israel, right? They would be able to acknowledge that. And those that aren't willing to acknowledge that usually happen to be the exact same people who either materially support Hamas or are driven totally by support for the Palestinian cause through their own anti-Semitic agendas, right? So this is actually a very good moment for, it's shocking to say that, but it's a good moment for us now to look at this, and you will see very quickly over the next 24 hours who the good faith actors from the bad faith actors are, right? Even if you disagree in total with so many other things they say, let's say like legitimate policy and political disagreements. Obviously, we're not talking about anti-Semites here. They immediately fall in the category of bad faith. But even if you disagree in whole with a lot of the things that people say on politics when it comes to this conflict, this issue right now will separate the good faith actors from the bad faith actors. And I think that people should actually pay attention to that.
I see now that Benny Gantz has said that either the hostages return or we resume fighting. So
yeah, this will be the standard position.
Getting more hawkish about this.
Yeah, this will be the standard. This will be the standard position. I would assume even from the more like even on the left flank in Israel, that will be the position among some, maybe not among all, but there needs to be real moral clarity here from Israeli leaders, right, across the spectrum, like from the left to the right. There needs to be real moral clarity about the position that we're finding ourselves in. And as counterintuitive as it might be to our current emotional state, which is to beg at all costs for the release of the hostages, sometimes the strong man demands and threats go a lot further with groups that have this kind of are governed by this jihadist ideology, especially when they don't have the power that they're trying to actually present to the world in all these theater displays, these grotesque theater displays that they've been doing every Saturday. They certainly don't have the power that they've been trying to present, right? So I'm not surprised to hear that Gantz said that. I'm interested to see what Yair Golan from the Democrats, the Labour Party, is going to say. Yair Lapid, but ultimately the best thing right now is to probably have some sense of a unified front against this. It's not going to serve getting the hostages out for us to go cutting each other's necks off, right? This is what Hamas wants. This is exactly what they want. Mm-hmm. They want to divide Israel against itself. So we have to be as sober as we can be dealing with this problem, despite the very difficult emotions that we were facing.
A little bit,
Samuel, if I could follow up.
Yeah. Please,
can I just ask one more question?
Yeah.
We had this discussion with Itamar before you came up about the motivations of the demonstrators and Netanyahu's, posture in all of this, where Netanyahu has not visited with the hostages. He has, sort of stepped away from showing any kind of sort of compassion and empathy with them. And, what kind of choices do you think he's had, and why has he been doing this way? And how is this sort of sabotaging his credibility in trying to create that sort of coherent policy towards, right now with the hostages? And it sounds like it's been a contentious security cabinet meeting too, lasting 4.5 hours. What's your sort of take on that situation?
Let me put it this way. We do monthly public polling at the Institute that I work at JPPI. And consecutively now for about a year, there's been between 25 to 27% public trust in Netanyahu. So that now includes from his base of voters as well, right?
Right.
That's a very significant thing. And our findings align with other institutes and media houses that are doing similar. It's pretty much anywhere between 25 to 32% public trust in Netanyahu. That's a very difficult thing to be dealing with here, being the Israeli population, right? You're facing a crisis that Israel has probably never faced of this magnitude before. And you have absolutely no trust in the person who's leading this crisis. And let's be fair to the people, for good reason. Netanyahu has spent the better part of a decade breaking everybody's trust. The entire reason he's in a coalition with Ben Gvir and Smotrich is literally, excuse me saying it this way, because he screwed over every single other politician and political party that he's worked with before for his own self-interests. Okay, so there's no one who will work with him. Okay, so these were the only people. So he legitimized some of the worst people in Israeli politics into mainstream governance, okay, in order to maintain his power. He lost a lot of trust with the public already prior to October 7th with the judicial overhaul, right? There was a broad consensus in Israel of over 60% prior to this that there needed to be some sort of judicial reform. So then why was it that about 70% of the people were against this reform? Because people in Israel understood that this was not merely a good faith action here to reform issues within the judiciary. This was for the Haredim to go and get military exemption. It was for Netanyahu to use to get himself off possible criminal charges and the corruption trial. and it was for Ben Gvir and Smotrich to mute the courts so that they could make attempts to annex the West Bank. People knew this. That's why 250,000 people were protesting them before October 7th. So there's been a total neglect of trust. And then you have to acknowledge that, of course, Hamas is to blame for the actual massacre. Hamas is who they are. But Israel and the Zionist project have a responsibility. One of the primary responsibilities of Zionism was a secure homeland. Netanyahu's policies for the better part of a decade in allowing Qatari money in the billions to go into Gaza and feed Hamas and motivate Hamas and build up Hamas, all the while knowing that these tunnels were being built and their military infrastructure was being built, and knowing that they were a genocidal jihadist organization, that is a catastrophic failure on the part of Netanyahu that leads to October 7th, and Israelis know that. So there's a lot of anger and fury, legitimate anger and fury directed at Netanyahu, in my view. And he keeps referring to himself as a Churchillian figure. He doesn't say it directly, but he keeps quoting Churchill in all his speeches that he gives to international media. But he hasn't behaved at all like Churchill. Churchill was an incredibly controversial figure in his own right, but he was a unifier. Churchill won World War II because he unified the British behind his aims. Netanyahu hasn't done that or been able to do that because no one trusts him, because he's given people no reason to trust him.
Samuel, what do you think or what do you think of, aside from this topic, the idea that Trump launched about Gaza after this war and making it essentially Gaza-Lago, which people have been joking about? What do you think about this idea that he has?
Yeah, I don't necessarily think like that's actually the plan. I think that was intentionally vague with very few little details. You know, I'm inclined to not make Trump sound like an ultimate genius here, because there's people who immediately say like, well, surely Trump's not thinking that way. But actually, when you look at here's a case in point, right? What happened with just before the Abraham Accords? Netanyahu was traveling around the world with maps, and he was showing people how he's going to annex parts of Area C, right? He's going to take that land for the state of Israel. Okay, and this was all, we know this today, that this was all a method to lure the Gulf to the table. And indeed, they did take that Trump-Bibi bait, and they came to the table to prevent annexation in exchange for normalization. And what that meant is they could then go and sell to their people, okay, that yes, we didn't secure a Palestinian state to the Arab street, because I don't think the leaders in the Gulf are terribly concerned, to be honest, about a Palestinian state, especially if it's got anything to do with the Muslim Brotherhood, who they've been doing, work over the past decade to get rid of. But people on the street do care about it. And even though these are kings and kingdoms and glorified dictators, they still have to have the favor on the street. We've seen many Arab revolutions being bought from the street. So they still do have to have some of that favor. So they could sell the Abraham Accords. Yes, we didn't secure a Palestinian state, but look, we prevented the Israelis from annexing this. And that really was a premise that clicked the Abraham Accords into place. It's very possible that Trump is looking at the situation, seeing, all right, we don't see a way to get Hamas out of power here. The Arab states have made it clear that they will only reconstruct Gaza, this being the Saudis and the UAE, for example. They will only provide finances or be involved in reconstruction without Hamas in power. They will not spend a penny in Gaza to reconstruct Gaza with Hamas in power, because that would just lead to another war. Okay, so they know that. And they've come to the table with absolutely no other proposals. The Israeli government hasn't come with any proposals. Egypt has been a sheer disgrace in the way in which it's handled this. I mean, it locked its borders. There were no demands made of it, and a lot of the cement and everything and financing that went into preparing this war infrastructure for October 7th came in through the Egyptian border, right? So on the one hand, it's very difficult to say here, because he made a lot of grand statements and a lot of bold statements and a lot of strong statements, but he didn't lay out any specific details on how he was going to achieve this, right? So I think that it could be a way of trying to force the Arab states to the table, because right now they've had this thing that there'll be no normalization with Israel unless there's an independent Palestinian state. And the reality is that until there's massive de-radicalization programs going on, let alone getting rid of Hamas and any sort of jihadist kind of element near governing authority there is no Palestinian state, right? At least not one where there's going to be any sort of peace. So everything's at an impasse here, and I think Trump was basically trying to present a plan that would seem totally insane and frighten everyone into coming to the table. That's possibly what could be happening. I'm not sure the Americans actually have any sort of desire to really run Gaza. I'm sure maybe they'll come and, own Gaza, as he said. The Americans certainly have a desire to reconstruct it and be involved in that reconstruction and whatever. On the other hand, I think that there's this polarized conversation about that Gazans shouldn't be allowed to leave because that's ethnic cleansing. Okay, fine, I understand that argument, but what happens for the individual Gazans that do want to leave, right? Like, what about them? Like, these statements are coming from people sitting in cafes in Los Angeles, right? And the question that I have for them is, would you and your children want to live in rubble for the next 10 years while they rebuild the Strip? Would you do that? Would you be willing to go and move and live in those conditions? So I believe, like in any war, the Palestinians should be offered the opportunity to leave Gaza if they want to. Okay, I'm not saying that that should be forced in any way, but I don't think this Trump plan is necessarily the goal. I'll be very surprised, to be honest, if that's actually the plan. Like, if they're actually going to go through and do that, I'll be surprised. I think it's a play.
We have a question here also from Louisa Kahn, whom you know from the Kusen Kaos organization here in Norway. And she's asking, talking of which, can Hamas be collapsed financially if Trump hit hard down on any sort of continuation of support, even to the humanitarian organization? Is there a way to do that for him, legally, internationally? Sanction countries who continue to support Hamas via these humanitarian organizations.
Yeah. Well, I've kind of long advocated for that on October 8th, probably the best thing, October 8th, 2023, probably the best thing the Americans could have done was said, Qatar, in 2018, we gave you non-NATO ally status, which is basically the platinum card of diplomacy in the world. You have been financing Hamas and terrorism while being a NATO player, non-NATO player, but having ally status in NATO, right? We are removing that status from you, which has drastic effects for Qatar on the international stage, more so than people assume, okay, until you are able to secure the unconditional release of the hostages. The same goes for the Islamic Republic. Biden removed all the sanctions on the regime, okay? They went from being almost economically collapsed and being able to sell like 250 barrels of oil a day to hundreds of thousands of barrels of oil a day, right? Those sanctions should have been reinstated until the regime pressured Hamas for that. The same with Egypt. Egypt and Lebanon survived basically off American aid, right? Okay, and I've mentioned what Egypt's role was here. Okay, and Lebanon's role, of course, their sovereignty was captured by Hezbollah, from which on October 8th, they were launching as part of the war. America should have threatened them with cutting all funding. And then you've got 4 parties pressuring Hamas already because they're losing drastically and they don't want to lose, not because they love Israel or they care for the Palestinians, but because they themselves are losing their power. And at that point, you've got all this pressure, this maximum pressure campaign being placed on Hamas by the US, but on Hamas's allies, right? Under the condition that you have 2 weeks to secure this. And if you don't, the Israelis are being let loose. That should have been, in my opinion, that would have been a better diplomatic channel to go. It wasn't done because Biden didn't see that worthy, because I think Biden's policy, as much support as he showed towards Israelis in an emotional way, I think Biden, the Democrats have for a very long time had a failure to understand how the Middle East works. So yes, it's possible, but it's people are going to have to start being comfortable with doing good and not feeling good, right? No one wants to say we need to cut off the financing for this and that could have effects on the Gazan population, because that just doesn't feel good. That doesn't make anyone feel like a moral good person. But in actual fact, you have to be cutting off the financial legs of the whole of the Muslim Brotherhood, not just Hamas, the whole organization, which has its web everywhere, including where you guys are in the West. Their webs are all there. Everything needs to be cut. Here's an example. There was a report released in October 2023 by the George Washington University's Program on Extremism that proved, using FBI wiretaps, that a Hamas network had been operating in the United States since the early 1990s. They wiretapped their meetings in which they laid out all their goals, which was to expose the savagery of the Jews, to oppose any sort of resolution, and to support Hamas morally in the media without endorsing violence, as well as to support Hamas financially by setting up a whole bunch of charity organizations that they called the Palestine Solidarity Committee, in which, I'm quoting this, they say, for every 100,000, we'll give 95,000 to Hamas and 5,000 to children. So people, and they did this, and they say, we'll do this under the guise of democracy, freedom, and rights, would deeply resonate with Americans. So the Muslim Brotherhood and all their chapters are operating all over the world. You want to end this, you have to cut off all the funding. That goes for Palestinian education as well. We released a report on the glorification of martyrdom and promotion of jihad and anti-Semitism. You can open any textbook from any grade in any subject. You'll find it. It's there. From 6 years old right to the time they matriculate and finish school, it's pervasive. We released a report, not at JPPR, at the institute I worked at before, that was given to the EU in 2020. And the EU actually cut funding to them in 2020 based on this. And what was the condition? To remove all of that and replace it with messages of peace and tolerance, right? But what was the outcome? They didn't replace anything with messages of peace and tolerance. The EU didn't only reinstate the funding the year later, they almost doubled the funding to the PA for the education curriculum. The curriculum got only worse. So there's channels here. The only way to cut the head here is to cut the funding, right? Once you cut the funding, you're now no longer dealing with regimes and organizations. You're dealing with weak ideologies. So,
the thing that occurs to me, the thing that occurs to me as you're talking about this is that I guess the West, but the UN has been unwilling to face certain very harsh realities about how these systems work, because we haven't wanted to deal with it on a real basis. And the only way to do that is to start talking about the problems in a serious way, right? Like it's fair that if you cut off humanitarian aid to Gaza, that may be necessary to cripple Hamas, but it will also hurt Gazans. And then talk about how do we solve that problem? Maybe there's ways to do that or mitigate it or something like that. But just to ignore the issue, which we're doing right now, is not doing anybody any favors. And I'm kind of shocked by the fact that nobody's talked about how Gaza was described as a totally subject to blockade, where nothing came in or out, and then it turns out they built hundreds of miles of subterranean infrastructure, bigger than the Disney underpark, with no other purpose than to preparing for this horrendous war against Israel. And then obviously this blockade wasn't that effective. If that's what came out of it. And we were not talking about that, which is kind of surprising because it's a real issue.
Well, I think the blockade was effective on the side of Israel. It wasn't effective on the side of the Egyptians, which is where most of it came in, right? So this is the point that I'm making. The Egyptians reneged on their agreement. We've had peace with them since for decades now. But when Israel disengaged from Gaza in 2005, a further agreement was signed with them that they will take control of that border. But there was no political will for years, right? I mean, remember, there was a time where Egypt was being re-governed by the Muslim Brotherhood and the Islamists in the last 2 decades, right? So, and Mubarak, all these people. So anyway, the point is that there's been no political will to actually secure that border, which is how all this concrete came in. But what you're pointing to is important because it leads us with the devastating effects of post-war reconstruction here. And my friend and colleague Einat Wolf always points to a very famous quote from Ernest Bevin in 1947, who says to the British government when he's reporting back on the mandate that there's two peoples on the ground and that they both have a top priority, and the top priority of the Jews is to establish a state. That's their point of principle, and the top priority of the Arabs is to prevent the Jews to the last of establishing that state. Now that's very important because it speaks to what you spoke about all this stuff coming in to build tunnels, right? Why is that? Because still, for Hamas, at least for Hamas, and I think for a lot, the priority, you've got billions coming into that territory. It's a small territory. You could have done wonderful things there. The only reason wonderful things weren't done is because the priority is not building wonderful things. It's not building a constructive life or a constructive future. It's building a war machine to destroy Israel. So this is what the Arab states who are refusing to now go and do another reconstructive and refunding effort of Gaza have woken up to. They're not going to pour billions in there if Hamas is going to be in power because they know what the outcome is. It might be 5 years or 10 years or 15 years, but all the billions that they're going to pour in there is going to blow up in another jihadist fantasy, right? So they're aware of this. So now we're stuck. But the problem with their awareness of that is that they're not coming to the table in the way that they also need to come to the table, which is realizing that the only way in which they can solve their problems in the region is by a full peace with Israel that isn't conditional on the immediacy of an independent Palestinian state, right? I'm not saying I'm against the two-state solution. In principle, I've always supported it. But we also have to ask ourselves about the reality on the ground right now. The reality on the ground does not serve any sort of two-state being established on the conditions that the Saudis sign a peace deal with Israel. That's not going to change any of the reality on the ground that Israel and the Saudis have peace. So the Saudis have to back off from this, and the Trump threat might be a way to try to both soften their position and actually give them that opportunity to basically send a message to their street. Yes, we did like the UAE did. Yes, we didn't secure a Palestinian state, but we prevented the Americans and the Israelis from ridding Gaza of all the Palestinians, right? Like that could be part of the strategy here. Okay, that's literally what unfolded with Trump and the Abraham Accords. I'm not saying that's exactly what will happen. There's no way of telling that, and predictions are usually for fools, but it's possible that is the play. So, but this is the last thing I'll say. Where I was recently in Berlin, and I was with people from across the region, from Bahrain, from Egypt, and from different countries, and we were all there, and we were all, very much against jihadism and the Islamist movement, and trying to actually work out programs and policies on de-radicalization. Okay, that was kind of really the purpose, and we were looking at other de-radicalization processes, denazification, the American occupation of Imperial Japan post the war, different things like that, seeing the application. Where is it applicable to the Islamists? Where isn't it? Because there's obviously differences in the ideologies you're dealing with here and the cultures and the peoples and the populations. So that's what we're looking at. But one thing that I noticed is that we were all on the same page of wanting that, let me say with the Bahraini guy, we were all on the same page of that we were super happy about peace between Israel and Bahrain and Arab states. And we wanted more of that. We wanted Saudis, we wanted the Oman, Kuwait, all these countries now to start coming into that fold against essentially the radical Islamist axis, throughout the region. But where we disagreed was on the role that the Arab world needed to play. They seemed to be convinced that despite the fact that this is clearly a regional conflict and has always been regional conflict, and that every single one of their countries, even those that never engaged on the military battlefield, they all engaged in diplomatic warfare for decades. They've all been part of this conflict in a meaningful way. And therefore, if you want to solve the conflict, it also has to be solved on a regional basis, and they have to play a meaningful role. So there's a hesitancy into how far they're prepared to play. And I think the Trump plan is basically trying to push them over the edge that they actually need to go to.
We have a viewer here who's called Titus Pontus, who told us on YouTube Live the latest news from Israel. Israeli cabinet member Minister Eli Cohen said that the cabinet adopted President Trump's position, return all the hostages on Saturday, or all hell will break out in Gaza. What do you think about this news, Samuel?
Yeah, I mean, it's the only thing that can be done, right? I mean, there has to be, like I said earlier, there has to be a unified front. We're not, I'm always very hesitant to make, this is why I've been speaking maybe about the motivations and the big picture things here, because we're not in those rooms, right? And my issue with journalists often is that they're also not in those rooms, and they speak as if they're in the room because someone's told them something, but that person's usually telling them something because they want to get a specific message out into the political field to start balancing dynamics. So I don't know what was spoken about, of course, in the room. I don't know what information the Israeli cabinet have on Trump's idea, what his motivations are, what their motivations are. They clearly have something. I think it's certainly not a bad thing that Israel is showing a unified front here in backing this, due to the reasons of why I said I think it's not only rational, but necessary. And 2 years ago, me and the word Trump would have never used the word rational, but I'm using it because it's true. I'm using it because it's true. This is rational when dealing with jihadists, right? Maybe not when dealing with Switzerland, but when dealing with jihadists, this is actually quite rational and necessary. So I'm not surprised that the Israelis are backing it.
I'm reading now from 7 Israel National News. They're reporting on this and saying that Minister Eli Cohen, a member of Israel's diplomatic security cabinet, on Tuesday morning told Galei Israel that Israel would not bend to Hamas's attempts at blackmail. Whoever thought that they could blackmail the state of Israel with such tricks and other things, it will not happen, he said. Cohen also added that Israel has adopted U.S. President Donald Trump's position regarding the full release of all hostages. The cabinet's position is identical to that of the U.S. president, the return of all hostages and bodies on Saturday, or hell, he said. He also hinted that Israel may renew the fighting if hostages do not continue to be released. We will adhere to Trump's words and adopt them, Cohen stressed. I see Hamas's announcement that they will not keep the agreement as a clear violation of the agreement, he says to 7 Israel National News.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very strong statement, right? But like this, here's, I'll say 2 things. This government is prone to making incredibly strong statements, okay? Unfortunately, usually with no plan, right? So I hope that they have a plan here, okay? The other thing that I'll say is, we can't confuse rhetoric for actions, basically. But the other thing that I'll say is that things have never really gone wrong when there's been no daylight between Washington and Jerusalem, right? Anytime that even when things have gone in the right direction for the Palestinians, for example, territorial withdrawals and all those kind of things for the Palestinians who actually have any interest in that and aren't interested in, from the river to the sea. But anytime that's happened, it's happened as a result of there being no daylight in between Washington and Jerusalem. That's why the Bush administration could achieve more withdrawals than the Obama administration. All right, that's why that happened. So I'm not sure exactly how this is going to play out. I mean, I know pretty much just about as much as everyone on the exact details and what the plan is, and by that I mean most of it we just don't know, right? We don't know what's actually unfolding. But it's a good positive sign that there's no daylight there for everyone involved. Actually, to be honest, It's a really good sign.
Yeah. Do you have a final question for him, Leif? I actually told Samuel like 20, 30 minutes, and we're already over time.
He's been very generous. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, something that's occurred to me several times throughout this process is this movie with my least favorite actor, Mel Gibson, but it was made by Ron Howard, called Ransom. Remember that, when there's a wealthy father, and they take his son hostage, and they're asking $1.5 million or something, and he invites to a TV show, and he says, "Here's the $1.5 million, and guess what? You're not getting it, because I'm offering it as a reward to anybody who could get you, because I know that you're not going to release my son anyway, and now I'm going after you." And of course, that makes for great movies, right? But there's a little bit of point to it, because all of a sudden he's making it very expensive for the hostage takers to hold on to the hostages, whereas they think they're going to they're going to have a payday from doing these things. He's turning the tables. And, I guess, we need some kind of creative thinking about that, about how we can make it expensive for Hamas to hold on to the hostages, to abuse them, that kind of stuff. I don't know what it would take, but that has to be a consideration, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Maybe Trump's threat today, maybe that's part of it. Maybe that's the redirecting of it. There was an element of me trying to get at that. What concerns me here is, because you bring up a good point, right, about that situation in that movie. And in a way, Israel did offer, they actually offered, money to Gazans to basically be turning in where hostages were. And we got nothing. And this is what I've said this recently. I cannot enter the hearts and minds of millions of people. I don't know what millions of Palestinians think. I know what driving ideologies are pushing the basic impulses of their politics and their movements and their organizations, which is basically no Jewish state. But I can't enter the minds of every single Palestinian. But it doesn't elicit any hope. Okay, and this is the message that I was saying earlier, the message received by Israelis. Okay, rhetoric again is one thing. It's one thing to oppose Hamas on Twitter, or oppose them in principle. But at some point, okay, this is going to have to come from the Palestinians, right? Like I said, even under the case of the Nazis, there were people that there were Germans who attempted to assassinate Hitler and overthrow SS rule. Okay, there were the white guard officers who tried to take out Stalin and bring his reign to an end. We just don't see that, and we didn't see anyone coming forward, right, who was holding hostages. And we know for a fact that some of those hostages were held by civilians, meaning other civilians definitely knew. It's not like they were all just held in dungeons, like in Hamas headquarters where civilians were not allowed to know. They were held in civilian homes, meaning other civilians knew, and no one came forward. No one's come forward. So when push comes to shove, the message that is received is that even if you aren't supporters of jihadism, your support becomes material by the fact that you're prepared to take no agency for the situation whatsoever. And this is the problem. This is the recurring cycle. So the longer the international community are not demanding that agency from the Palestinians, the further and further and further away we get from any hope for a peaceful resolution here. So you're right about changing the tides there. I don't know how that would work though with this population. It's not eliciting any hope from me. And like I said, I'm not in their minds and their hearts. I don't know what they think. I know what their movements and ideologies represent, but I don't know what each individual thinks. But I know that it doesn't seem like there's any actual valuable, meaningful dissent that's happening here.
Right.
Yeah.
That's concerning.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Samuel, I want to thank you so much for your time and for popping in here on such short notice. Thank you so much for bringing us your thoughts and your reflections on the development situation.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Stay safe.
Stay safe.
Thank you. And you guys too. Keep well.
Thank you. Yeah, that was Samuel Hyde who came in there talking to us about the situation developing in Israel right now. And for all the Norwegian viewers watching now, wondering if we are very terribly confused about language or something, it's just that we have a lot of English viewers watching us right now as well on YouTube Live and X, and we've had a lot of English guests, so we're just going to continue the conversation in English, I think. What are your thoughts, Leif, on this, what we've heard from our guests and the development situation now that we know that Israel is also adopting Trump's position on this, on saying that all hostages will be released Saturday or all hell will break loose?
Well, I think it depends what, I mean, I suppose everybody would feel that the best, not everybody, not Hamas, but most reasonable people would agree that the best possible outcome is that the hostages get freed right away and that Gaza and the Gazans come back to sort of building up a society that's more sustainable, and that needs to push Hamas out of the picture. And then there's the longer term issues about the sort of the point of principle that Bevan talked about, that this was an irreconcilable difference between the two groups, which I think is longer to deal with, namely that the Palestinians appear to have as their goal the prevention of or the resistance against a Jewish state, and the Israelis have their goal to keep a Jewish state. And those are, as Bevan said, those are irreconcilable things. And I'm one of the people who, have been very doubtful about that. And I haven't seen any evidence to the contrary. And I hope it gets presented, because it's a pretty sad statement, because those two things really can't be reconciled. You either have a Jewish state or you don't, so that's a longer discussion. But I think in terms of what's going on right now, I think that the important thing is to balance the need for the hostages to be freed and preventing Hamas from doing this again. And it was sort of both discomforting and reassuring to hear what he said, which was that there's very little faith that this is something that the Netanyahu government can do. It's vindicating in the sense that that's what I've been worrying about, but I hate to be right about those things. I wish there were more reason to trust what they're doing, but we'll see. Trump is, for better and for worse, really shaking up things right now, and that may lead to disastrous things, or it may lead to good things. And I'm sure he'll take credit if it leads to good things, and he'll blame somebody else if it doesn't lead to good things.
What do you think about the upcoming Saturday now? Now it's like, it's been difficult all along, but now it's really difficult to say what's going to happen with this kind of ultimatum going on.
Yeah, I mean, Hamas has said they're not releasing any hostages on Saturday, and they haven't said when they plan to do it. And they've been also very non-specific on what it would take for them to go back to the schedule. So the ball is in the court of Israel and the United States and whoever else they could bring along on these things. I think it's certainly possible that Hamas is bluffing because they don't have as big a good as a hand as we've been assuming. Maybe they don't have as much power in Gaza as we've been thinking, and maybe which would be good, and which would be tragic, is if the hostages are in such bad shape that they can't really negotiate with them anymore. And these are things that we don't know, and I'm sure that the Israeli intelligence community is doing everything they can to find out what's really going on, including the U.S. intelligence services and probably lots of other intelligence services as well. And I think there's a lot of pressure on Jordan and Egypt. As a matter of fact, King Abdullah is meeting with Trump right now, and he's negotiating for F-16 airplanes that the U.S. has sold to them, and also probably other things. So there's a lot of things that are moving right now. But I think in order for this sort of Saturday noon thing to happen is that they have to have the sanctions lined up so that if hostages aren't released on at 12 noon Israeli time, 11 a.m. our time, then bad things are going to start happening immediately that are really going to hurt Hamas.
What do you think
But I
those
don't know
bad
what those
things
things are.
are?
Some of
No,
them may
no.
be invisible.
Yeah. It's
Yeah, well, the most obvious thing would be that Israel resumes the war and starts, takes back the Netzachim corridor, starts bombing Hamas targets, so forth. That would be pretty obvious. But there could be things going on in the background too, such as targeted assassinations or funding that dry up, or I don't know, exploding pagers or the
yeah,
equivalent of that. Who knows?
yeah,
Who knows what the things might have? But I'm sure they're trying to line up some things right now. And I think that the Qatar connection is the wild card because the U.S. actually has a lot of leverage with Qatar that they haven't used, and maybe now is the time to use it.
yeah. Soul says, "Thank you for an interesting and meaningful 2 hours with insight information about the situation in Israel. We don't have inside information, but
I
we
wish
have
we did.
yeah, but insights. Thank you so much for that. So we also have a question here from Titus Pontus on YouTube Live. Life and Henrik, can anyone explain where the Norwegian government hate for Jews is coming from, and why they are not seeing clearly the BS of UN and UNRWA and Hamas? Can you explain any of that? Where's the Jew hatred in Norway coming from?
I don't think that they're mostly motivated by Jew hatred. I think that the reasons why the Norwegian government is taking the political position that they're taking, I think it's a complicated thing, and I think it has to do with the constituencies in Norway, such as LO, which is run by radical political operatives. I think it has to do with this Norwegian tendency to want to feel, like Samuel was saying too, about feeling good versus doing good, which Einat Wilf also talked about, which is a bit of a Norwegian illness. I think it has to do with secular religion that we have in Norway, that has to do with the UN. And I was raised with that as well, that the UN was the greatest hope for humanity. And I think that goes back to Trygve Lie's role and Hammarskjöld's role and stuff, sort of a Scandinavian thing. And I think it's a combination of all those things. I think that prejudice towards Jews plays a role, but I think it's very much sort of in the collective unconscious that we need to discuss a lot more. But I think very few politicians are thinking, oh, I'm going to get those Jews. I think it's very little conscious anti-Semitism. But I think there's a lot of unconscious ethnocentric prejudice and so forth that we haven't done enough to explore. So that would be my very, very short answer to a good question that has complicated things going on.
There should really be some more research on that, like a really good and thorough research going into that, especially in Norway, which has really been singled out as the most anti-Israeli country in the whole of Europe by the website Ynet News in Israel. So there's clearly something strange going on in Norway, and it would be really interesting to pinpoint what it is. We also have some more questions here. Jonas says maybe Trump and Israel will take out Iranian oil. Anything to cut their funding should make a difference. What do you think about this, Leif?
Well, the maximum pressure regime that Samuel mentioned, Trump has actually reimposed this on Iran, and that makes it very difficult for Iran to export oil. But it takes a little while to have its full effect. And in the past, Iran's been able to resell oil through Iraq, but I'm sure they're finding ways to plug that hole as well, so to speak. In terms of bombing the oil fields, I don't know if that's something they could do, but it doesn't really matter, because what's the point of pumping out oil if you have no place to sell it? But I think that's actually in the works, is to prevent Iran from getting foreign currency by preventing them from exporting anything at all, in this, especially oil, and that could really happen.
We also have a question here from, or a statement or comment from Else Martin here, who says that this should have been said long ago before Trump and from many leaders in many countries in UN, that the only language these monsters may listen to, I guess she's saying that that kind of ultimatum that Trump is coming with, that kind of harsh, strong language is the language you have to have when you're talking to terrorists like Hamas.
Well, if you look at history, most leaders of countries and empires and so forth have been motivated by one thing only, and that's power, right? And so I think it's a nice ideal that we have a world order that's based on rules and tractates and codes of conduct and international humanitarian law and so forth. But the reality is that we have history going against us. I'm not saying we should abandon those principles, but we should look at it, very pragmatically. And Trump, again, for better or for worse, probably mostly for worse, is motivated by power, both domestically and internationally. He thinks that all these other things are nice, but not really relevant if you could get away with doing things your own way.
So the latest developments for the ones who's just catching on now and joining us is that actually the Israeli leaders in the security cabinet have said that they are adopting the position that Trump has stated, that either you give us all the hostages back or all hell will break loose on Saturday at noon. So that's a position that also the security cabinet in Israel has adopted, and they were in a meeting for 4.5 hours, which says a lot that this was something that they were contemplating and discussing, I guess, quite thoroughly, and that's what they've landed on, according to some international news sites that I've been reading. And are you surprised by this, that they actually adopted this position, or perhaps they didn't have a choice when Trump is saying this, that they can't roll back on it and downgrading it perhaps afterwards? There's a lot of diplomacy.
Well, what they've done so far with Trump's things, that they've said things like, "Oh, that's interesting, that's creative," sort of avoiding, in large part because Trump also changes his mind a little bit. But I'm reading now that they unanimously supported Trump's stance. So so that changes things a little bit, because basically what they're saying is, so you want to postpone the returning some of the hostages. Well, guess what? We are now insisting that you return all of them on this particular day. And as I said, I assume that what they probably were arguing about for 4.5 hours is what things they would put in line up to punish Hamas if they should not do this. And I think we can be pretty confident that Hamas is not going to deliver all the hostages Saturday at 12 noon, unless they really get demonstrated what things are going to happen to them. Because remember, Hamas doesn't care what happens to the Gazans. In fact, it serves their purpose.
Yes.
If more of Gaza is destroyed and more Gazans are killed. So they must have some other measures in mind, in addition to or instead of those things.
Yeah, it's like a game of chess, right? They will only adopt this or like be flexible about this if they feel like they have something to lose. It's just a zero-zone game that they're playing. So I guess this is the only thing that they could do, I guess, or the best thing that they could do from the U.S.'s point and from Israel's point, is just to speak the terrorist language and try to give them an offer that they can't refuse.
Yeah. Well, and Samuel made an interesting point, which is that when Israeli and the U.S. government are lined up, when there's no daylight between them, things generally go well, and honestly, the only thing that could make, the Palestinians could want to replace Israel with their own state in one way or the other. Israel is not going to is not going to allow that to happen. Israelis do not accept that, and you may agree or disagree with them, but that's just not going to happen. So the only way out, the only way for a good life for the Palestinians is some kind of two-state solution in which that, taking over Israel no longer is on the table. And that's a mental and emotional adjustment for them, which I'm sure is difficult, but it's necessary for everybody there to have a better future.
Yeah. I think we should go in for a landing now. We just passed 2 hours on this recording and on this live session. And we thank you, Leif, for joining up here and talking about this. And thank you to all of our listeners. We had around 250 people listening in now. And thank you for all of the questions and the comments and for watching us and following us here. We're probably going to have a lot more of these kinds of podcasts, both planned podcasts and emergency podcasts, probably as things are going on further down the road here, and perhaps after Saturday also, after Shabbat ends, perhaps we'll do something. Who knows? We'll see the developments, but hopefully the greatest thing of all would be if actually all the hostages are returned and hopefully alive. So we'll keep our hopes up there.
From your lips to God's ears.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, thank you, guys. Thank you, everybody. And we'll see you next time.